Peter, and hello everybody. It's great to be back at one of these webinars and to have the opportunity to share the Irish experience with you around sort of the psychological and social dimensions to over-indebtedness. And I'll be talking a little bit as well about how money advisors can work with people to help people to overcome those different or to address them, those particular effects of over-indebtedness, be they psychological or social. So Stuart Stamp is my name. As you can see, I'm an independent social researcher and also a research associate with a university here in Ireland, Maynooth University, just outside Dublin. And I'll be sharing with you information from sort of three sources. First, some academic studies, as Dieter has mentioned there. Also some research reports, European reports into these issues. And finally, I'm going to be sharing with you some of the experiences of our money advisors here in Ireland in relation to the sort of things they witness when they're working with people to help them overcome debt problems. Okay, Noel, so next slide, please. So the background here, over-indebtedness, it's a financial issue, we know that, but my perspective is it's very much a welfare issue or a well-being issue for people. So it has hugely important dimensions around people's health, welfare and well-being. And the psychological aspects to personal debt are identifiable. And as we've heard already, sometimes these are identifiable in academic research. Sometimes they're identifiable in research reports done for European bodies or national bodies. And sometimes they're identifiable by money advisors themselves. I hope it's okay to use the term money advisor here. I know debt advisor is used as well. In Ireland, we tend to use the term money advisor. If that's all right, it's the same thing. We're talking about debt advisor. I'm sorry if I don't want to confuse you by using different terms, but if you hear me using money advisor as a term, I'm really talking about debt advice and debt advisors. The social dimensions to debt problems, they're also very well documented. We'll be looking at those. And from our experience in Ireland, these play out at four sort of levels. The individual or the personal level, the household level, okay, because people live within a household. Sometimes it's a single person household, but often there are other people in the household, a partner, children, maybe extended family. So, over-indebtedness can affect those household members as well. It can play out at the community level, and it can play out at the societal level. It can have an impact on society as a whole. Particularly in terms of the use of public services, if people are experiencing, psychological and social impacts of over-indebtedness. But these effects are also relevant to the work of debt or money advisors, because in understanding what's going on for people who present to money advice services, person-centered money advice or debt advice can have a much greater impact if we understand actually what may or may not be happening in people's lives. So it's important context, the psychological and social dimensions from the perspective of non-judgmental, empowering, human rights-based money advice work. And they're the three key principles, certainly from my perspective, and I think from many of us in an Irish perspective, that money advisors or debt advisors, it's not the role of a debt advisor to judge people's behavior or reactions. It's important that we empower people, through their problems and to help them rebuild confidence and skills and knowledge and so on. And the human rights dimension is important as well. And there's two aspects to that. One is helping people exercise and access their legal rights, consumer rights, welfare rights, but also that we look at and gather the experience of people coming to money advice centres and gather those in such a way that we can then bring that evidence to policymakers, to governments, and suggest change, which would make things better for people in the future and maybe prevent people, getting into difficulties in the first place. So I hope that makes sense. That dimension, that sort of policy dimension to money advice work, I think is also very important in this area. Is it okay, Noel? The next one, yeah. So the psychological aspects to personal over-indebtedness, this is the first, if you like, bit here. And there's much research into this from Scandinavia. We'll be hearing from Frederick this afternoon. Richard Ahlstrom has done a lot of work in Sweden as well on this. In the UK, in Germany, and we'll be hearing, I think, Nicole this afternoon giving that perspective, plus some in Ireland. And this research tends to stem from concerns around the mental health dimensions to being in financial difficulty. Okay, so there's been a lot of sort of emphasis around that. But these concerns are also relevant to people's readiness to take action, and thus to their capacity or ability to work with money advisors. Okay, so these impacts can actually hinder, if you like, people's ability and readiness to take action. People might be in a bad place. They might not be in a good place psychologically. So their ability to work with money advisors may not be there at the outset, and that may take time to develop. So, for some people, you just need to be patient and go at their pace. And help them to take action when they're ready to take it. Over-indebtedness also has physical effects. We'll be looking at some of those in a minute. And I think a useful concept here in terms of what we're talking about is you could maybe see these as symptoms of what we might term a lack of financial well-being. And this is maybe a term that many of you or maybe all of you have come across. Financial well-being is defined as the extent to which someone is able to meet all their current commitments and needs comfortably and has the financial resilience to do so. Okay, so there's three dimensions: being able to pay your current commitments, your rent, your mortgage, utility, bank loans, etc. Also to meet your needs, your food, clothing, etc., comfortably without worrying about it. And also that you have the financial resilience to do so, and indeed to deal with future problems which may arise unexpectedly. Okay, so financial well-being is a very useful term, I think, and it's something which, as money advisors or debt advisors, we have a key role to try and work with people to build or rebuild their financial well-being. Next slide, please, Noel. Is that okay? Can you see the next slide there? Yeah. Okay, so the context here is something that sometimes is referred to as the slippery slope of insolvency. And this is maybe quite a useful chart in terms of understanding how people can get into quite severe debt problems, how those problems can develop over time. This was actually produced in the 1980s. You can see at the bottom there by the Birmingham Settlement Money Advice Centre in the United Kingdom in one of the early debt counselling handbooks. The settlement are one of the oldest money advice centres in the United Kingdom. And we've found this useful in training in Ireland to give our advisors a sense of how a debt problem can escalate. So just very quickly, I'm going just to talk down this. The tipping point, if you like, is often what can be referred to as a debt trigger. An external event, something like unemployment or illness or marital breakdown, something like that, that is actually, if you like, the tipping point that starts the problem rolling. And that is generally followed by a person missing a payment of some type. Maybe they miss a week's rent or a month's mortgage or a utility bill or something like that. And that can lead to a bit of creditor pressure, pressure from the bank, from the lender, from the institution, usually fairly gentle at this stage, not always, but often. But then in an attempt to deal with a debt problem, stage 3 there, people can often, what we sometimes refer to as robbing Peter to pay Paul. I hope you've maybe heard of that phrase, the idea being that instead of paying your rent, you pay your electricity bill. and next month, instead of paying your electricity bill, you pay your bank loan. So basically, you take money, if this makes sense, from one payment and put it towards another payment, and that leads to the spread of debt. So you now end up in a situation where you've multiple debts, with people with maybe 3 or 4 or maybe more different commitments that they're trying to juggle, if you like, and debt begins to spread. When you have multiple debts, you have multiple pressure. So the pressure is now coming at a person from different angles, from different institutions. And at this stage, it's very common to see people making contact with the creditors. This is stage 5, and promising to repay something. And often that promise to repay is unrealistic because they're under pressure from the creditor, from the bank, from the electricity company, the mortgage company, whatever it is. People will just usually often agree to anything in order to get off the phone or just, to buy a bit of breathing space. Stage 6, if that promise to pay is unrealistic, it tends to lead to a broken promise to that particular creditor. The payment is not made, or it's made maybe for a month or 2 months, but then it's not made anymore. And that can lead to further increased pressure on people, and even possibly at this stage, debt collection companies, debt collectors, who are then engaged by creditors to collect debts. At stage 7, we can start to see diverse personal reactions. People can become very frustrated that they can't resolve the problem. They can become angry, maybe, that this problem is still persisting. Some people are in denial. They bury their head in the sand. They literally try and hope that the problem will go away at some point. People can be fearful. They can be worried. Maybe they may go to prison or lose their home or whatever it is. And a very big one on stage 7 there is the very last word, isolation. And our experience is that people can often become very isolated by all of this. They withdraw, if that makes sense, into themselves and into their households. At stage 8, legal pressure starts to come into play. Demands from creditors, solicitors' letters, summonses from courts, maybe a court order in relation to a debt. So now for somebody, it's as if the legal system is actually against them, if you like, in this particular stage of the problem development. At stage 9, we've financial chaos, huge debt problems causing havoc. And then at stage 10, the debtor can find him or herself facing quite severe sanctions, maybe the loss of their home, the loss of their utility supply, gas or electricity, the loss of essential items, if those items are bought on, for instance, hire purchase, a type of credit where they won't own the goods until they make the final payment, and indeed potential loss of liberty, because for certain debts, particularly in Ireland, such as court fines, if you don't pay a court fine, you may be imprisoned, for failure to pay that fine. And at the bottom of the slope, stage 11, further losses are possible. Perhaps a relationship, marital relationship may break down, for instance. Health may deteriorate. People may indeed suffer a breakdown. And as Dita mentioned at the start, people may contemplate even, suicide, that things have got so bad. So, I think this is quite a useful sort of map, if you like, of how somebody can start with quite a small debt problem and how it can escalate. And just before I finish on the slide, I think the important point to note is that ideally we want people, if they're in difficulty, to approach debt advice services, money advice services around stage 1 at the outset, before the problem starts to escalate. But unfortunately, for reasons that we'll see in the next slide or two, many people try and struggle on for a long period of time. So they actually approach the money advice or debt advice centre maybe at stage 6, 7, 8, 9. You see what I'm saying? If you like, when things have got very serious. And of course, what that means is that it becomes very difficult then for the money advisor or the debt advisor, because there are many more problems. There's a lot more, things have happened and the situation is a lot worse. So I think it's very important as debt advice agencies, money advice agencies, that we try and encourage people to come to us at an early stage, and the policy, indeed, government policy, tries to encourage early engagement and intervention with money advice services. This next slide is just is based on a piece of work we did with our money advisors or our debt advisors in Ireland in 2006, 2005, 2006, which was the peak of the Celtic Tiger in Ireland. Some of you will know of that phrase. It was a period when a lot of credit was extended in Ireland, and it led obviously to a lot of problems when we subsequently had the financial crash in 2008. And what we did is we asked our money advisors what sort of things they were seeing, what sort of issues were their clients presenting with at that particular time. And so this is not a scientific sort of list. It's a list. It's more of an indicative list, if that makes sense. It indicates the sort of problems that people may have when they approach a money advice centre. So on the psychological side, people reported being anxious. Some people were quite bitter. They were angry at the situation they were in. And people may blame other people. They might blame themselves, but they may also blame government, policymakers, for policies which push them into this situation. The credit boom is one example of that. In Ireland, many people blame the banks for lending too much money. Conflict was very common. Money advisors talked about that. Conflict in the home between partners. In terms of children, obviously children wanting money to do certain things, certain activities, and the parents just didn't have the money to give the children. So that led to conflict in the home. The word constant appeared quite a lot. You can see a constant sense of crisis, tension, or worry. And this is very concerning because it suggested that these problems were there all the time for people in the background. Whenever people talked about thinking about these things almost all the time, the problems were there, if you like, at the background of life, minute by minute. Denial we've talked about, fear we've talked about, people being scared of what might happen to them, people feeling helpless or unable to cope, a sense of frustration, that somehow whatever people were trying, they just couldn't get out of these financial difficulties. And a sense of guilt, that people felt guilty about not being able to manage the money, even though in the vast majority of cases, it's external events which have caused the problems. But nonetheless, people still could feel guilty about it. A sense of hopelessness about the problem was identified. And that word again, isolation, kept coming through. People trying to deal with these problems on their own, in isolation, retreating, if you like, into themselves. A lack of enjoyment in various aspects of life was reported. People sometimes could see no end in sight. The isolation dimension meant that people had no one to share their anxieties with. People talked about that, not being able to talk to anyone else about their problems. They internalized them somewhat. And then people, not inviting friends or relatives round to their home because they couldn't afford to do so. They'd have to maybe cater, do some food, or maybe, drink or whatever it was. Some cases, people saying they were becoming embarrassed about their possessions, that they couldn't afford to replace. That sense, again, of sort of pessimism, of, pleasurable activities being reduced. Shame featured a lot. I think Dieter made reference to that in his introduction. People being ashamed of their situation. Sleeplessness featured in some of the reports. And of course, if you're not getting enough sleep, you're not able to make rational financial decisions, or indeed any decisions. And you get this sort of vicious cycle almost. Stress was mentioned by people in a variety of areas, trying to, keep up with things going on in the community, the neighbours, buying clothes, but also just the stress of not being able to afford things for the children, maybe school trips for the children, for instance. The suicidal tendencies issue we've mentioned before, people feeling vulnerable, worrying at night. So a very disturbing list of different consequences came up from this exercise, and also some physical effects. You can see at the table at the bottom there, agoraphobia, some people saying they actually felt that they couldn't go out now, they were scared to go outside. Various blood disorders, breakdowns, people consuming more medication, pills, illnesses getting worse. Some people talked about increased alcohol consumption, trying to drink, hoping the problems would go away. Of course, that creates more expense, which creates more problems. And as you can see, weight loss, hospital periods, migraines, nervous disorders, a variety of different psychological and physical effects. And the point I want to make here is that this doesn't mean, of course, that every single client has these things, okay? And debt, over-indebtedness can affect people in different ways. It's just an indicative list of the types of things that people may be experiencing. And just the last point to make before I move on to the next slide is that often, and I remember this from my own days as a money advisor or as a debt advisor, you could be sitting interviewing a client and thinking that person looks fine. They seem to be fine. They look well. They sound well. There don't seem to be any problems there. And I very quickly learned that you shouldn't presume or assume that just because somebody seems to be okay and looking well, that they actually are. There might be a lot of things going on, below the surface. So it's just to make that point, just to be sensitive to that. I think it's important that debt advice services are sensitive to that. On the social side, I'm not going to spend too long on this slide because there's a little bit of repetition here. But these were helpfully summarised in the European context by a study done for the European Commission around 2012, 2013, published in 2014. Certainly each of these issues is relevant in an Irish context. And this report for the Commission was very useful, I think, because it split the consequences, the social consequences, into two. The first were consequences that affect social relations or participation in social life in society, things like a reduced standard of living, deprivation, being forced to go without items or things or activities that society tends to consider to be the norm or the convention. The stigma we've talked about, people being excluded from sort of social norms, perhaps even employment or financial services because of their debt problems. They couldn't participate in those sort of service use activities. Relationship difficulties and breakdown, we've talked about that. We've talked about isolation and the loss of support structures and resilience. When people become isolated, the various supports that they may have drawn on, a partner, extended family, community, they can often be reduced, because people are trying to deal with these things on their own. And that can lead to a loss of resilience. It sort of makes things worse for people. They become less resilient to deal with the next problem as it comes down the tracks. And withdrawing perhaps from the family and the community. So these are consequences that affect people's participation in society. But there are also consequences that can be considered, if you like, punitive or punishing. These are consequences imposed by the wider society on households. Things like sanctions, housing exclusion. That means people can face loss of their home, maybe their eviction from their rented accommodation or repossession of their mortgage property. Imprisonment, as I mentioned, in certain cases, or the disconnection of utility supplies. So there's sanctions, if you like, that wider society places on people who don't pay their debts. There's also financial exclusion, which I've mentioned, and reduced labour market activity. In other words, people become less able to participate in the employment market. Maybe they're employed, but their work is suffering because of all these problems going on in the background. So just a couple of final slides now, looking at the implications of all of this for money advisors or for debt advisors. I think the first one is it's really important that any person-centered debt advice service treats clients in a non-judgmental and respectful way. This is absolutely crucial. And it's important to note that the second bullet point, the clients will often become emotional when they feel heard and valued by a money advisor during the first meeting. That is very, very common. And I hope you can see why that would be. If people are experiencing all these various psychological and social impacts, when for the first time they meet somebody who treats them with respect, with value, who listens to them, who doesn't judge them, that's the first time maybe that person has spoken to anybody who listens to them and hears them in that way. And people can become very emotional. It's a very humbling experience, I think, as a money advisor or debt advisor, but a very powerful one, and very much the first step to building a relationship of trust with that client that can help as you move through the money advice process. So it's very important that anybody engaged in debt advice has counselling skills, not that they're counsellors themselves, but they have counselling skills in terms of listening skills and being able to ask appropriate questions at the right time. The third point there, third implication, is that loss of power may be visible, almost palpable. And I remember Richard Ahlstrom from Sweden coming to talk to us in Ireland many years ago about work he'd done around these sort of issues and the consequences of over-indebtedness in terms of health. And he talked a lot about how he'd seen people losing power. They weren't able to do as much as they would have been able to do previously. So that's a very important role for the money advisor, to support the client to rebuild that power, to regain that power. And in doing so, it's important to go at the client's pace. Okay, as I say, some clients will be ready. They might be in a better place, if you like, psychologically and socially, and might be able to move quicker through the process. They may only need advice or information. They do things themselves. Others will need a lot more support and help over a long period. So it's important to go at the client's pace. And this idea of mutuality, of partnership working between the advisor and the client is very important, that we see our relationship with the client as a partnership. Yes, we have, as money advisors, the knowledge, the information, or the experience that we can share with the client, but we work with the client in a partnership way rather in a sort of a dependency type way. I hope that makes sense. I might talk about that in a second. Because the idea of advocacy should be to empower the client. And I think that's a useful concept, the idea of empowering advocacy, to try and discourage a client becoming dependent on the money advisor for a long period of time. Okay, so these are hopefully useful ways of thinking about the way we engage with our clients in money advice services. And building and rebuilding confidence can take time. So the last slide, some techniques for rebuilding client capacity or confidence. As I say, if we think of working with clients in a partnership or a mutual way, I think that can be very useful. We have to be sure that the client makes all the decisions from the options that we make available to them. Okay, so our role, if you like, as money advisors, is to present the client with the various options based on our experience and knowledge, but it's important that the client makes all the decisions, makes the choices, because that's a very important part of building confidence and empowerment. Now, at the start of the money advice process, that, as we say in the third bullet point, the money advisor, the debt advisor may need to do more at the outset of that process if the client is not yet ready to do things for himself or herself. Okay, so if the client is in a difficult place, then the money advisor may need to take the lead a lot more in the initial stages in terms of advocacy and dealing with creditors and all the rest of it. But the aim should be to try and encourage clients to do more for themselves as and when they are able, okay, as we go through the process. And some services, I know MABS in Ireland as an example, has almost like a client contract, or it's called a customer charter and a service level agreement. The idea is this, this is a partnership, we'll work with you, this is what you can expect from us, and this is how, we would like you to work with ourselves. So just to think of it in that way. The fifth bullet point here, lapses and relapses are common. In other words, the money advice process is not linear process. It doesn't necessarily go from A to B to C to D. Sometimes things happen to people, things go wrong. Maybe they discover a debt that they'd forgotten about, and that destabilizes, if you like, the repayment program, or an emergency happens or something like that. So very, very important, okay, we might have to go back a couple of steps in order to go forward. Again, just don't lose heart, I suppose, is the big lesson there. These things happen. And just the last couple of points, engaging in change talk can be useful, asking clients what they would like to change about their situation and why. What are their goals? And just to give an example here, one of my first clients many, many years ago were in very deep, serious mortgage arrears. And I presumed they wanted to keep the family home and stay in it. And it was only after a number of meetings I discovered they actually didn't want to keep the family home. They had come to me to help them find another home, maybe a rented home, because they'd had enough of the mortgage and the mortgage problems, and the house had many bad memories for them and so on. So I presumed wrongly that they would want to keep the family home. If I'd have just asked them, what are your goals? What would you like to achieve? It would have saved me a lot of time. That was a mistake I made as a very young money advisor at the time. And just the last point, positive reinforcement, very important to recognize results, support people's self-esteem. Say, you did really well to renegotiate that loan with the bank, well done. That was a great, to encourage and build that confidence and that self-esteem. And just to finish on a positive, actually, evaluations of money advice services are often talk very much about how engagement with the money advisor or the debt advisor helped to take away stress and rebuild people's confidence. Hugely important, non-financial, if you like, impacts, but very, very important. And also that once people had begun to deal with their debt and money problems and rebuild confidence and skills in that area of their lives, they also discovered that those confidence and skills could be applied to other areas of their lives. You see people maybe finding employment, or maybe self-employment, or going back into education or training. So, very, very important. The role of the money advisor can be much, much more, if you like, than just assisting with the financial side of it. It can have a huge personal, individual, and I think societal impact as well. So on that positive note, I'll finish and hand back to Dieter now. Thank you.